So, welcome. On behalf of the North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force and its leadership team, welcome to the 2025 NC Demand Reduction webinar series, Behind the Demand, a webinar series on trafficking prevention. We are glad that you're here tonight. We're glad that you recognize that this issue of fighting human trafficking and looking at prevention, and specifically looking at demand reduction as a prevention strategy, is something that can't just be done by professionals in the field. Can't just be law enforcement. It can't just be legislators. It's a community issue. And so we are going to need you to join in and to help with this. We do have a word from our Attorney General that he'd like to share for you. So just one moment while I share my screen again.
Hi, I'm Jeff Jackson, Attorney General from North Carolina. Thank you for the invitation to speak with you. Thank you for your work on the part of the Demand Reduction Task Force. I had a chance to see the different areas of focus that you have. I want you to know that NCDOJ remains firmly committed to doing everything we can to eradicate human trafficking. And I completely agree that a big piece of this is education, making sure that folks who are on the front lines know what the signs look like, because this is so often a deeply hidden crime, and helping to expose that crime by teaching social workers, nurses, and teachers exactly what some of those signs look like is extremely important. I also support the fact that you are helping to get the word out that this is serious felony in North Carolina, and I want to assure you that we will do everything in our power to support the investigations and support the prosecutions of people who are charged with this felony. Thank you for your work. I'll see you soon.
We are, of course, happy to have the support of our Attorney General. We realize that many of you may not be familiar with this task force, and so I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and tell you a little bit about us. So our mission is to create and execute a comprehensive plan to reduce demand for the service of exploited persons. So I think the most important thing in there is comprehensive, because what we're looking at is we want to bring all different types of people together, create this plan, and then it's going to take all of us to execute it as well. Our goal is to launch effective demand reduction programs to address both labor and sex trafficking based on available evidence and best practices. So just a little bit about the webinar series itself. Each session is going to explore a different aspect of what fuels trafficking and how every individual can help stop it at its source. We're going to eliminate the root causes of trafficking, empower participants, that's you, to reduce exploitation in their own communities. And our ultimate goal is to inspire you to action. Together, we're changing the conversation from awareness to action. So the different webinars that we have tonight, of course, we're going to discuss how demand fuels the human trafficking industry. So sort of introduce you to the topic for those of you that aren't as familiar with it. Next week, we're going to learn how culture shapes the normalization of objectifying and exploiting people. In our third session, we're going to listen to a survivor describe demand reduction from her perspective. In each one of these webinars, we're going to share ways for you to join the demand reduction movement. And in the final session, we're going to put it all together and empower you to invite others to the movement including those in positions of power. So before I introduce our speaker, I have just a couple of housekeeping items. And we will come back to that. So I would ask you please to put your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. And I really appreciate those of you who have introduced yourselves in the chat. Sometimes you'll find colleagues that are close to you, maybe friends, but then you might even better find someone that's working on this issue in your area that you didn't know about. So please put your information in the chat and take a look at that and see if there are any friends or soon to be friends there. If everyone could stay on mute, that would be wonderful. So now we're going to get started by meeting Dr. Eleanor Gaetan. She is the Vice President and Director of Public Policy at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. She has served as Senior Coordinator at the State Department in their Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. She did that for 5 years. She was a White House appointee, and then she worked as a senior advisor for the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. She first met the human trafficking issue through the eyes of its victim in Bucharest, Romania, as a USAID local democracy advisor. She attended Yale University, has a PhD from the University of Maryland, and is mother to 5 fabulous young adults. But what I want to tell you about Eleanor is
Wait,
that
I
I've
didn't
known,
add my new grandbaby.
oh, I have known Eleanor for a lot of years. I'm not really sure how many years, but a lot. And I just want to tell you that she just has a genuine passion for this issue and has taken the time to, she doesn't just speak from the emotions. She has gone out and learned the facts and read the research and can really educate us about this issue. So I am now going to turn it over to my colleague and my friend, Eleanor.
Thank you so much, Pam. All right, I am going to get this rolling. And okay, now what do I do? Does that look all right? Sarah, go. I'm with a colleague, Sarah Thacker.
It looks great.
Yes, it looks perfect.
Okay, great. I have no confidence when it comes to virtual anything, even after all these years. So, as Pam said, we've known each other for a long time. And what is so extraordinary about the human trafficking field is how much the progress has been tied to individual champions and small groups of people. We have this wasn't even a defined crime until 2000, the year 2000, with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And we'll get to a slide that's got some definitions on it that are quite relevant. But when I was at the Human Trafficking Office at the State Department, there were 2 documents that really defined for my boss, Ambassador John Miller, his like sort of fundamental thinking about human trafficking. One was a study by Dr. Melissa Farley, who started an organization called Prostitution Research, and Sarah will put this study in the chat, but it was published in 2003 or 4. It's a 9-country study of over 800 women who were in prostitution in 9 countries, including the US, Turkey, South Africa, Canada. I mean, truly a global study. And she found data like 75% of the women had been raped, and 68% had PTSD on the same level as combat veterans, and 71% had been homeless. And this, very important, 89% wanted to escape. And this for us in 2003, 4, in those early years of the State Department's Human Trafficking Office was really definitional because it showed the harms that are inherent in prostitution and human trafficking, as everyone who's on this call knows. But then the other study that came alongside Melissa Farley's that was super influential was a study by Michael Shively. Dr. Michael Shively continues to be one of the nation's most important subject matter experts on demand reduction. He was hired by the Department of Justice, DOJ, to study a report called the First Offenders. It was a final report of the evaluation of the First Offenders Prostitution Program. It was a program done in San Francisco. And Michael came to the ambassador to say, he sought us out, came to the ambassador and said, I have to flag this research for you, because when my company was hired by DOJ to study the First Offenders Program, study sex buying and what would deter it, I thought, this is like one of those ways the federal government spends money that's useless. And he had no faith in that there would be anything conclusive coming out of his study. He walked away from that study saying it was one of the most effective programs he had ever studied in his whole career in criminal justice research. And that was a John School in San Francisco that gave a class to those who were buyers. It was a diversion program. So sex buyers could divert from criminal penalties by taking this class. So of course they all took the class. But the sort of research on the opinion research, the poll taken when they came in versus when they left, they claimed they had absolutely no idea that so many women are trafficked, so many people are stuck in this scenario of sex trafficking, and that it's not what they want to be doing. And that there was a great deterrent effect because California had fantastic data across the state. They could track whether or not there were other arrests in other jurisdictions other than San Francisco, and they found a really low recidivism rate. Michael Shively has continued to do research in this field and is an important person who has informed some of the work we'll talk about. But what's so important is, like any phenomena in the free market, the demand drives the supply. Now, in this case, we're talking about human bodies. But in any analysis, free market analysis, you look at ways to either encourage demand because you have a product you want to sell, or ways to discourage demand because this is not something that is healthy or safe, or it's poison. So you look for ways to deter, drug sales. But this, because pimps, traffickers are often the facilitators of the transaction. There was, of course, most of the attention has gone to the idea of prosecuting traffickers. These prove to be very complicated cases. And it's also true, and you might hear this in your survivor panel in a few weeks, when you talk to survivors, very often they talk about their anger or resentment toward the buyers who take advantage of their vulnerability, abuse them, and walk away. And there's very low rates of arrest or fines for sex buyers. So there's a lot of anger that you track when you're talking to victims of sex trafficking who say, the harm they caused is they really resent the harm they caused. And especially they cause this harm that can be ruinous and lifelong. And yet they so often walk away with no repercussions. So demand reduction is mainly a strategy for combating sex trafficking that takes advantage of the sort of really common sense, what we know. If there was less buying, there would be less reason to satisfy that demand from traffickers. And we will get into into an interesting twist on, aren't buyers traffickers? And under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act passed in 2000, you can really see that the true definition of sex trafficking really finds prostitution and sex trafficking to be almost synonymous. So a major problem, of course, in the United States is it's not a problem. It's a beauty of our nation, but it's also a complication in our nation. There was a giant attention to human trafficking by Congress, and they initiated it as an international policy, right? It was mainly looking abroad, and it was mainly inspired by people around the world, especially seeing how women and girls in the former Soviet Union and the former Eastern European Warsaw Bloc countries were being lured all over the world and being taken advantage of, put into commercial sex trafficking scenarios when they thought they were getting a babysitting job or waitressing, and this is what I saw on the front line in like 1998, 99 in Romania, where I was working for USAID. all the people, voices from around the world, including USAID, came back to Congress and said, this is a horrific situation and what US leadership could be deployed to confront this. So TVPA, Trafficking Victims Protection Act, is passed. Let's move along here. But it conceptualized the US role as largely an international leadership role through a tip report. Meanwhile, where is most sex trafficking encountered? It's at the local level, at the county level, at the state level. And the information and research and attention to human trafficking at the federal level wasn't really translating so quickly to the local level where the rubber meets the road, where the cases of sex trafficking are found. And so we have this interesting gap. So even when we can intellectually know that demand reduction is really primary prevention, like, can we say that awareness posters are primary prevention? No, they're not. Can we say that as important as education in the school is for kids to avoid predators, absolutely crucial, a form of prevention, but not primary prevention. Primary prevention is shrinking that demand, which will shrink the number of people who are victimized. So we do encounter, of course, around the country, this case for full decriminalization of prostitution. Let's be clear. Those bills decriminalize buying, they decriminalize brothel keeping, they decriminalize pimping. Because even in a place like Germany, where we have essentially legalized prostitution, where there are over 500 legal brothels in the city of Berlin alone, where you have over 1 million men buying sex every day in Germany. Like, that demand is exploded since that law in like 1999 or 2000. And who are the women in the brothels? Mostly not women from Germany, mostly not Western European women. They're mostly poor women from places like Romania, Ukraine, China, all over the world, really. But like, just want to say up front that it's important to keep in mind when we're looking for policy solutions to remember that the full decriminalization of prostitution, which is often hung on, my body, my choice. I want to have a BDSM operation business in my basement. Let me do it. Like, in fact, that's cover for buyers as well. Definitions and parameters, really important I'd say the most fundamental disagreement we have between those of us who think we need to pay attention to demand and really shrink the demand in order to shrink the number of victims. And then our opponents want to fully decriminalize the commercial sex trade. And facts are, it's mostly money from the multi-billion-dollar industry, which is the whole range of commercial sex SOBs, they're called in some states, sexually oriented businesses, strip clubs included. So these definitions, we see an inherent connection between prostitution and sex trafficking. And let's look at the definitions in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, because that's the bill passed in 2000, bipartisan, passed in 2000, and largely oriented toward international, but it applied to the US. And gradually we began adding titles, like the first domestic trafficking chapter was added to TVPA in 2008, 2003, and 2008. But let's look at this definition. TVPA's definition of sex trafficking. Sex trafficking means the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, patronizing, soliciting, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. That is synonymous with prostitution, is it not? And when we talk to people who drafted this legislation, Congressman Chris Smith from New Jersey is right there still in Congress. And he says, absolutely. The more we studied the phenomena, we knew that in the legal brothels of Germany, where women from Eastern Europe were being trafficked, they were overtly selling prostitution, but it required luring women in because there aren't enough women with other options that want to be there, as we learned from Melissa Farley's terrific research, nine country research. So that definition of sex trafficking is like crystal clear. And here's an interesting little legislative history trivia point. In 2015, we passed a bill called the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act. It's a domestic trafficking bill. And in that bill, sponsored by John Cornyn from Texas, we added 2 words to that definition. We added patronizing and soliciting, because there have been a couple court cases that looked at obtaining of a person and saw that as the sex buyer. You obtain a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. We said, let's make it crystal clear that the sex trafficking definition includes buyers. So we added these 2 little words, patronizing and soliciting. That is crystal clear that now you cannot, no buyer who gets, who contested an arrest could say, that they aren't committing a crime. But here's the thing. Do we have a common understanding, widespread understanding that that these are synonymous terms, that sex buyers are traffickers? No, we know we don't have that common understanding. And here's part of the reason why. Again, legislative history tells you a lot. In that 2000 bill, severe forms of sex trafficking, it created severe forms because the DOJ was operationalizing the law and wanted to get at, it was a workload problem. They're like, we got to focus in on the worst cases, the worst of the worst cases. And in the cases of prostitution, it's when you have force, fraud, or coercion. Now, I think so many subject matter experts are on this call. You could be teaching this class too, but I bet there are people who say, really? I didn't realize that in TVPA, it's broadly taught that the definition of sex trafficking is this force, fraud, or coercion. Those are the elements. Those aren't the facts. The facts are the definition of sex trafficking is the one above, which includes soliciting, patronizing, obtaining, and the severe forms are the force, fraud, and coercion. Now, the facts are, we all know coercion also can be interpreted as homelessness is a form of coercion. Drug addiction can be a form of coercion that compels you into the commercial sex trade. And that's a little more clear in the international convention, the Palermo Convention, which was passed in 2000 as well. But the facts are sex trafficking, prostitution, these are illicit markets, and they function along the same market principles of supply, demand, and distribution. So this is both a legislative history and just, tracks with the facts that trafficking and prostitution, it's most of the time false dichotomy. I mean, they're just inherently connected. And in 2003, the president signed a National Security Presidential Directive, NSPD 22, which actually enshrines that as a point of national security policy, that the US government is never supposed to advocate for prostitution as a legitimate form of work around the world because of that inherent connection between prostitution and trafficking. So let's see. Why is this not moving? I've pretty much said all this. It's the consumers of commercial sex. We've got the online environments now, right? So you could say those subscribers to OnlyFans are, more and more frequently we're understanding that OnlyFans has pimps operating and controlling women that are coerced into that camming. And so those sex buyers of OnlyFans, they're also exploiting women who there's a third-party controller. Also, there's a really super interesting Avery study. I don't know, Sarah, if you can find the Avery study on OnlyFans, and it's one of the few studies that interviewed people on OnlyFans and found what a very high percentage were lured into real life. Meeting those subscribers would say, I'll pay you 10 times more if you meet me in real life. So that's being sort of lured into prostitution or commercial sexual activity offline, and then are so vulnerable to all the ruinous impacts and influence of what it all means to be sex trafficked. So let's see, this gets a little, for the evening, this is getting a little sort of heavy with words, but so much excellent work is done, and by organizations that like you some on the call, direct service providers. I went and toured Thistle Farms in Tennessee. What an extraordinary program! And they have a social, the entrepreneur. They're sustainable because they have that cosmetics and candle making and wonderful social enterprise. But can we ever have enough shelters? There's a point at which, especially if you're in touch with victims, and the stories are so heartbreaking, and the way in which this world is so hard to escape. It's also expensive to escape. You know, the cost of the medical and the psychological and the legal to get those expunge those criminal records. Like it's all expensive too to get somebody back to a really happy, productive life. And that makes you think, you know, what are our alternatives? Um, we know that traffickers are always innovating. And we know that there aren't enough services in order to find and serve all victims. So it's just a natural intellectual exercise to say, we got to focus more on the buyers. And then where we've had like an almost laissez-faire, like in Baltimore City, I'm in Washington, D.C., and Baltimore is very close by. And they have just stopped enforcing the law effectively in Baltimore. And so it's almost a de facto full decriminalization system. And it's ruinous. I mean, there's so many problems around and so many victims of human trafficking in Baltimore who are getting no services. So goes back to something I mentioned earlier. When you talk to victims, how often they'll say that they resent the buyers and what they get away with. And this is from over 10 years ago, but it's just I hear this often, and it's you have to go after the Johns in order to really confront human trafficking. So that's, really a major message here I wanted to deliver. And I don't think it's surprising at all. Many probably agree with that. There's only been one really significant, rigorous study. It came out in 2018. But who are these buyers? And one of the most important things that emerged in the study, and it was done by Demand Abolition, which is an NGO that Ambassador Swanee Hunt started. She no longer maintains it, but she put all of her research at Nkosi, and we continue to review it and operationalize it. But the vast majority of men had never bought sex. What was super interesting in this study, and it was close to 2,000, it was over 8,000, that's right, men, it was really a big study, was that about 20% of the buyers were driving 75% of the trade. We call them high frequency buyers. But what's extraordinary about that is that means you could target them. Like law enforcement can target the high frequency buyers because they're the repetitious driving the market, creating pain, harm, and trauma. So this study also found what a low rate of those ever having been arrested. And the risk of arrest is an important deterrent. Other studies you can see here, Sweden is interesting because it really adopted something called the quality model or the survivor model. It's not a crime to be selling yourself or being in prostitution, but it's a crime to buy sex. It's a crime to traffic or have a brothel. And that study found what's, again, common sense, frequent pornography use. And looking at Atlanta, Georgia, that study was super interesting because it found what a high percentage of men were going to arrange to meet a minor. And the question and answer was set up so like they really had 3 chances to back off and say, no, what am I talking about? What am I doing? 15-year-old? No, absolutely not. No way. These are some motivations, won't review them in any detail. Loneliness, sex with little or no emotional involvement, thrill, variety seeking. So many survivors are telling us that they're acting out things they see in pornography, that buyers come in with like scenarios that they've seen in pornography they want to act out. That's like the whole way in which the mind mimics and mirrors and wants to act out. And then this pathology, the wanting to be in control or dominating and humiliating, right? How often Rachel Moran, really an extraordinary survivor in her book Paid For, is one of the best on prostitution and sex trafficking. And she always said, this isn't sex, it's a power play. It's all about power. So the research that most recently Michael Shively led, and it was done at Nkosi with a DOJ grant, was super fascinating because it found it analyzed the tactics being used to apprehend buyers. And what we're finding is across the nation, I mean, really, truly across the nation, law enforcement is using a variety of tactics and in every state. But there's very little national leadership on this. It's so everyone's solving the problem separately. And the community, the sort of reduction tactics are a typology that Mike Shipley divided here. And you can see the most common are called reverse stings. It's where a decoy operation is designed to apprehend buyers. That's number one. Like, so the most are these. But further on down, something like booting cars systematically, like Atlanta did that, vehicle seizure, and then requiring letters home saying your vehicle was on the track and engaged in or adjacent to commercial sex trade. And that was considered a very high deterrent by buyers. Now, applause for North Carolina. 4 states have made sex buying a felony offense. And it started with Texas in 2021, and then Oklahoma, Montana, and North Carolina. And boy, Pam Strickland, you and your allies really Stop Human Trafficking in North Carolina, Shield, North Carolina, and so many others were crucial to this passing the solicitation of prostitution bill. And according to most recent research, like 100 cities and counties are arresting buyers and publicly disclosing their identities. Now, not all, there's sort of no cookie cutter, there's no sort of answer to what a program needs to look like. We have this research from the aughts that said the San Francisco First Offender Program was really excellent in reducing recidivism. We've identified 4 John School programs. There could be more, again, because we don't have sort of a clearinghouse that's collecting this information. The very common use of reverse stings where mainly it's decoy ads online, and then law enforcement arrests the buyers when they come in. These now, 1/3 of these reverse stings target buyers of children. Part of that is because there's no pushback on enticement. Like it is such a it is such a felony offense to try to buy a minor for sex that there's sort of like no defense. And so law enforcement is most comfortable with that approach because then they don't get trapped into like legal battles with the buyers trying to get out of it. You know, I think some things are supporting victimless prosecutions. The problem, so many cases fall apart because, and prosecutors will tell you, we're shy of cases against traffickers because victims are not excellent witnesses. They had to disassociate to get through that experience in their life. And so they sometimes don't remember things, or they're inconsistent, or they're also afraid. And you all know that, everybody who knows that. And so we want to have more victimless prosecutions. And we're moving in that direction, but not fast enough. This some people are trying, like Atlanta, the mayor of Atlanta did a lot of billboards and posters, and it was Dear John campaign. That's a kind of public awareness that was good, but then she leaves office and it doesn't continue. So they even had PSAs, public service announcements in Atlanta. Let's revive that. Let's share that approach with more cities around the country, because there are different tactics. A lot of us know Street Grace or the EPIC project. ChildSafe.ai doesn't exist anymore, but they're trying to use technology to disrupt buying. EPIC uses real people. The teams mainly of men who do decoy ads, and then they start talking to the buyers and say, hey, they're pop-up ads at first, but then it's actually interaction with the team at EPIC saying, this is illegal, and you're causing deep harm to the woman that you think you're buying. And do you want to talk about it? Why are you here? And they get a certain percentage of people that want to interact. Street Grace is got a tool called the Gracie. It's just coming online to help law enforcement do more systematically at lower cost, these kind of stings. And then I've mentioned the John schools. The gold standard of John schools was up in Washington State, King County. Peter Colatino, who's now lives in Massachusetts, he developed it, and it's over 6 months. In Maine, the state of Maine now is doing John schools that last for over 6 months. Now, obviously, it's not every day. It's like once a week for 6 months, but it's pretty long, and it really gets into the impact on communities, on families. I mean, it tries to digs into like that buyer. Is this a form of addiction? What's leading you here? And try to sort of bring forth the pathologies and solve the problems for the buyers too. Happy to give you more information on these approaches if you're interested. So let's like kind of come faster through these, because how are we doing for time, Pam? You can see I just get started talking, and maybe we just pause soon to see if anyone has comments or questions. But this is an
Doing great.
evidence-based.
You've got plenty of time.
Okay, so this is an evidence-based model for preventing trafficking. Shively often says like there are few criminal interventions that have so much documentation that they work, and yet they're not being systematically unfolded. They're not being launched systematically across our nation. Again, we get back to this problem that it's a local and a state. It's generally the laws covering prostitution or local and state laws. I've been on Capitol Hill where an office literally said to me, quote unquote, never bring up the P word here, meaning prostitution. Okay, fine. We'll talk about sex trafficking because they're basically synonymous. But it's just, there's like this division of labor sense that states and counties and local have to take action, and everyone knows how overwhelmed they are. The model that this Nordic model, equality model, survivor model, call different things. Hopefully we'll move towards use of the survivor model. You know, it has these prongs. Not only do you arrest and publicize those buyers, but you also are providing support to leave, right? Support to exit ramps. As direct service providers know better than I how that this is expensive and complicated. And then not dropping the task of going after pimps and traffickers, but so often they are also engaged in drug running or guns, or they'll shift the criminal enterprise away from women if there isn't a market for it. You know, we have to flag the fact that Nicosi never uses the term sex work, because we think that, I think Donna Hughes demonstrates that it was invented by the pimp industry. But we also have a problem with this inattention by the federal offices that have that bird's eye perspective. And frankly, we've been in talking to HHS and DOJ over the last few months to say, you know, let's highlight the best practices, who's doing this well, and have a federal initiative. If the Attorney General just said every human trafficking program nationwide should have a demand component, this stuff would be rolling out faster, wouldn't it? We have won every state, every fight where we have confronted the pro-prostitution movement. We've won because the facts are with us, and that's been in 11 states total. That movement began, the first place was 2019 in DC. And so that's then a lot of information. I think the main message I wanted to say was like this, there is research to support the efficacy of strategies, policies, and laws that focus on sex buyers in order to shrink the sex trafficking market. Where we're at is really pressuring law enforcement to its political will, right? It's really pressuring governments, state governments, local governments to step up and make this the part of every anti-trafficking program. Now, the legislative approach that we favor the most, the North Carolina, you all have started with it, right? It's the felony offense. Make this a serious crime that no one wants to do. Like, you cannot leave your job at the patent office, go buy sex in DC, go back to your patent office. No, that's illegal, and you're gonna get a felony, so you're not gonna do it anymore. right? But we're seeing in state legislatures being totally honest with frustration. We're seeing this sort of hesitation, or we came very close in Kansas and Idaho to passing this bill. And then things behind the scenes that we could not perceive because we weren't enough behind the scenes intervened, and poof, the bill didn't pass in Kansas. Well, is that the good old boy network? Is that legislators thinking, they don't want their friends who just made a bad decision? They were buying sex and they really knew better, and they had a wife and family that was going to be hurt by their arrest. Like, that's pretty pervasive too, right? That old boy network. So what about, and we have a professor from Catholic University of America, Mary Graw, is researching this right. What about what domestic violence movement did something? Mandatory arrest, but not a felony. Mandatory arrest. The cop comes toward the house. There's a ruckus. Somebody's doing something to somebody. They just arrest the usually the guys, right? They arrest the men. Sometimes they don't even paper that offense, but they separate and they scare. And that mandatory arrest is considered a crucial tactic that was developed in the 70s by the domestic violence movement. So we're looking at that. Is that a way we could get around the old boy network that is resisting responsibility and accountability for sex buying? Open to your suggestions on this, but North Carolina is at the front. And so focusing on implementation, and even last point, I have a wonderful colleague, Stephanie Powell, who's unique because she was a Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD. She was a vice sergeant. Then when she left, she was very moved by the problem of trafficking and the people in the commercial sex trade who were victimized. So she went and joined a sort of on the rocks direct service provider, and it's called Journey Out. She put it back on its feet, and she signed an MOU because she's a cop, former cop. She has all these cop friends. She signed an MOU between the LAPD and Journey Out that said, every time you identify a victim, you call us, fast and furious. And we provide the direct services. And Stephanie just said, we still couldn't get that buy-in from the LAPD to support locally wait, actually they did for a while. They had it because San Francisco did have that first offenders program, but it's kind of dissipated. I don't think it's as systematic now because the NGO closed, SAGE, it closed. And that's our other problem. If things aren't codified, we feel like things come and go with political will or whims. So I have certainly talked enough. Let's open it up and let's all talk together.
I could listen to you talk all day, Eleanor. I love it. Of course, it is one of my favorite topics. For some of our folks who may not be as familiar with full decrim versus partial decrim, could you just kind of lay that out real clearly for them?
Sure. Let me use a real life example. So the DC City Council, a city councilman introduced a bill that said, for the health and safety of sex workers in DC, we're going to decriminalize the commercial sex trade. And you can no longer arrest for prostitution. You can't arrest for buying sex. You can't arrest for being on the track. All gone. We're going to fully decriminalize the commercial sex trade. Immediately got 5 supportive votes. City council of 11 people, 5 city council members jump on. Do you know who the most effective voices that we went door to door and met with every single staffer and every single member of the council were teenagers, kids who had been picked up often in trap houses or on the street. They had been victimized, and they were proven. The Metropolitan Police told us these are sex trafficking victims, and they went to all the members and the staff and said, this will increase demand, and our friends are going to suffer what happened to us. And those youth beat that bill back. But when there was a hearing for it, the hearing was 13 hours long. They didn't put a cap on the time. They just let anyone who wanted to testify. And we were almost equally divided between the people who were fighting against it and those who were arguing for it. It was heartbreaking because as the night proceeded, say it started at 3 and went till midnight. As the night proceeded, all of those who spoke in favor of full decriminalization were describing traumatic experiences, and often they were describing sexual exploitation as youth. And then they felt that they had various issues and the only job they could do was sex work. And so you realize, oh my gosh, our hearts are breaking for you too, right? You've been victimized by really terrible situations and reality. So after that hearing, we won. They went into their chambers and they didn't take a vote, but they said that bill was shelved and it's never come back again. But full decriminalization is really just letting the lid off the commercial sex trade and saying no holds barred. It's taking its page from the marijuana movement. There's probably the NGO that's the lead behind this is called Decriminalize Sex Work. And I'm not going to put the link here, but sometimes we watch decriminalize sex work because they're kind of good at flagging bills that we then turn around and beat. So I do go on that website pretty often, but the policy director came out of the cannabis industry. He successfully moved the cannabis law like from Colorado across the nation. Now, how well has that gone? Especially for, you know, new evidence of psychological disturbance from those who start smoking marijuana too early. They're not analogous because as a friend of mine always says, women are not weed, but there is a policy phenomena that's like a copy paste. And we see it in New England where two of our weakest states have been Rhode Island and Vermont, kind of left-leaning states where they've danced with these bills and we've so far defeated them every time. But it's when survivors come forward, as in Rhode Island last year, survivors came forward and said, do not do this. It will explode demand, increased demand will mean more victims. And that Senate committee turned around and now have introduced a bill that's partial decriminalization, which says, do not blame the victims for this. Do not create criminal records for women in prostitution who are then going to be stuck with a criminal record and they can't go on field trips with their kids. They can't rent apartments. They can't get a loan for college or university, right? The impact of the records is to trap you in this horrible life. So get rid of that. We don't want anybody charged. We don't want women, and it's some boys, of course, and some men, certainly some trans women, but we don't want anybody charged for that. In DC, we said we will help create a trans affirmative action program so people get jobs in the DMV. And we don't want them out on the street because there were too many trans people saying, this is my only choice. This is my only job I can do out on the street, on the track. We're going, we'll help you find jobs because we don't want anybody harmed out there on the streets. But so partial is saying, yes, decriminalize the piece of prostitution, but get even more fierce on the buyers because they're the ones creating all the harm. And they walk away and they never have to pay for years of psychiatric PTSD. They don't have to pay for dealing with PTSD, right? So, and of course, the traffickers still keep it a crime, keep brothel keeping a crime. Pimping's got to be a crime. All those got to be a crime. Focus on the men who are causing the harm.
Great. Thank you so much, Eleanor, for explaining that. And, for those of us here in North Carolina, we have not achieved partial decrim, which is, as Eleanor just said, the victim, the seller of sex or the person being sold for sex, not getting charged, but the trafficker and the buyer does get charged. However, we are fairly fortunate, I think, because we do have a number of law enforcement agencies here in North Carolina who just don't arrest the victims.
Right.
So in some areas, we kind of have a de facto Nordic model. And, we're really grateful to those agencies, and we will continue to, talk to law enforcement and invite you all on the call to, talk to your local law enforcement and find out what their policies are and sort of help them understand that the victim is not the one that's causing the problem. It's the buyer.
Right. And the ideal is something like a hybrid model. And Sarah, you might post like the model legislation we have, or even the title, or we get it to you afterward. But it's a system. We need exit services, but there's not enough money in human trafficking direct service provision. So how about making the fees and the fines should go into services for survivors, and create not a vicious circle, but a virtuous circle of take the money from the guys, fund the direct service provision, and give a little piece of it to the law enforcement because it offsets the sort of expense of doing some of these things. That was done in San Francisco in that study that Michael Shively said he felt like he had caught lightning in a bottle when he studied this, the low recidivism rate. Let's recreate those systems. New Hampshire just passed a law this year that takes the fines and puts it in direct services, but the fines are kind of low. We got to get more fierce about that, and I think it's the frontier where we want to be working in terms of new laws, or more importantly, implementation of smart ideas.
So, Eleanor, we've had a question, and this is something that we have, as the Demand Reduction Task Force, sort of been struggling with for almost 4 years now, I guess, is we want to understand how best to treat the buyers, the ones who, there are some who they're just doing it for a thrill. They've only done it once ever in their life. It's not a big part of their life. Um, but then you've got some people for whom it's a real compulsion. And the threat of, sex buyer education, the threat of being arrested, that's not going to stop anyone who has a compulsion. Do you have, or can you tell us where to look for um, a list of treatments or best practices in terms of treating the buyers?
It's so interesting. I'm going to ask Peter Corotine. I think he will know, and we'll get that to you. Also, Melissa Farley probably she has a great website,
Mm-hmm.
prostitutionresearch.com. I'm pretty sure I'll test that. Um,
Okay.
really interesting, back to the champions, how much we have accomplished through passionate individuals. There was in King County, Washington State, there was a prosecutor. No, he was Val Ritchie. What was his job? He was like the deputy prosecutor, I think, in King County, but he made this his priority to flip the switch and stop arresting anybody in prostitution, focus entirely on the buyers. What they did was they discovered a massage parlor that was all Korean women, and they've been trafficked largely from Korea in Seattle. Instead of just, they did shut it down eventually, but for a couple weeks, they tracked the hobby boards and really tracked how there were reviews of different women in the massage parlor and how they were calling themselves hobbyists or mongers, but they had review boards and tracked those reviews, and then they arrested on a higher level, like the crime was facilitation of prostitution, basically a trafficking cause of action, and arrested them all, and they all had to go to trials. Like this was like serious because people lost their jobs and whatnot, and they were high frequency buyers that were driving the market in the city of Seattle. And Val said the biggest thing he had to accomplish was convincing, his boss and the chief of police and stuff that they should wait a couple weeks and track this sort of intelligence and not just take down the massage parlor overnight, and deport those women. So that was a very interesting sort of in real life experiment that showed, yeah, there are clever champions can find workarounds to identify the high frequency buyers, and hopefully Street Grace will their tool, the Gracie tool, will help us do this.
Another question, I wanted to know if you could say the name of the buyer education program in San Francisco. I think they wanted to look it up.
Sure. And Sarah, that's I have that final report teed up. It's the final report of the evaluation of the first offender prostitution program. It was published in 2008 as a DOJ study.
I have dropped that in the chat. I can drop it again if that would be helpful.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Sarah.
Sarah.
Thank you so much.
All right. We have more time, y'all. If y'all have more questions, please bring them out. Eleanor, something that I have read a number of articles on, and I'm sure you have. Um, can you help us understand why in somewhere like, say, Germany, when prostitution becomes legal,
Mhm.
why is it that all of these people are being imported
Yeah.
and many times they're not even working in the legal brothels, right? They're working outside the legal way
Yeah.
of doing it. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, kind of a bizarre and really quite sick phenomena, but you see it actually in Nevada, you see it in New Zealand. There's only one country in the world that fully decriminalized the commercial sex trade. That's New Zealand. And if you watch the TIP report, the Trafficking in Persons report produced by the State Department every year, New Zealand starts sinking down from tier one, which is you're trying hard, your government's trying hard to combat human trafficking. And it sinks down to tier two because there hasn't been one human trafficking prosecution, not one in at least 4 years. Because once they made decriminalization, once they decriminalized the commercial sex trade, there's never a cause of action. There's never a time that cops can go investigate a potential crime. And another thing that happened in New Zealand and also is true in Nevada and is also true in Germany and some of the countries that have legalized it is the abuse of children. Child sex trafficking grows up, it increases. So that's happening in New Zealand alongside the legal brothels. Why? Because of this novelty where people who are buying sex are like looking for different experiences, more edgy, more illegal, like more illicit, and they move to kids. So you have really high rates of child sex trafficking. Anecdotally, cops tell us this, but it's not being prosecuted because cops don't have a reason to ever go near those brothels. They're just functioning like a sandwich shop, right? Now in Germany, police are among the best informers who say we have very high rates of human trafficking. I mean, there are women in those brothels that like when I worked for USAID, I would meet planes where it was before Romania was part of NATO and part of the Schengen. So any Romanian that was identified in a brothel in Germany was shipped back. She was just expatriated. She was just flown back. She'd have nothing. And these would be like 18, 20-year-old women. And they were like zombies. Like they had something had pulled their soul out of them. They were hardly functioning. They were just shocked. They were in shock. And um, you know, the US government was paying for a shelter, but it was like a penitentiary. And so they ran away very fast and we couldn't track any of those cases. Heartbreak. It was what brought me into this field. But what the women who I'd talked to say is they had no idea how to make it stop because they didn't speak German, right? So that's another thing they're doing. They're bringing in women intentionally who can't even speak this language. And the police are among the best sources who say we have very high rates of sex trafficking, but it's normalized. And that normalization and fact, as my boss back in the aughts said, he dared to say in the Netherlands, the state's the biggest pimp here. Amsterdam, the state's the biggest pimp.
Mm.
And, he got his hand slapped by the State Department for being rude to the public officials in the Amsterdam meeting he was at. But that's a fact. Like you begin incorporating that money into the public treasury, the taxes those brothels are paying. There's a seven-story brothel that until fairly recently you could buy a bratwurst and a woman as part of your same entrance fee. Like that's despicable, and that's normalization. Sometimes if you're in Nevada, like you'll run into this phenomenon. In Nevada, there are high school fairs where working in a brothel, in the legal brothels, is presented as an option at the high school fair.
So we have a question asking if there's any research connecting religiosity is the word they use with buying sex.
Such an interesting question. I'm going to look for that. That is a great question. But I happened to be today at a meeting. It was at the Heritage Foundation, where number of doctors and psychiatrists were presenting evidence on the impact of screen addiction, and like, rates of depression, rates of suicide, rates of self-harm, all tracking it after 2008 when smartphones become ubiquitous. And they showed religiosity declining on the same scale of time scale with the advent of the smartphone. I'm going to ask Melissa Farley, and sometime you should talk to her about coming on. She's wonderful.
Yeah, she is amazing.
Amazing. And she might have something on this too. It's a super interesting question. I'm going to pursue it.
So, in partial response to that question, we know that pornography consumption is very closely related to the purchase of sex. I mean, we know that it increases demand for the purchase of actual commercial sex. And there was a study done several years ago by the Barna Group that, and I don't remember the exact numbers, you'll have to forgive me, but I can look it up. But what their study showed is that the number of people who consume pornography, the percentage of people who consume pornography was the exact same between Christians and non-Christians. Now, I can't speak to every religion because their study was specifically, geared to Christianity. Um, and their study also had all these questions that had been asked of pastors and youth leaders and, people who we put on a pedestal. Um, that that because this was an anonymous survey, were willing to admit that they struggled with the consumption of pornography, either currently or had at some time in their past. So I don't know that I'd say, just based on that one study, it wasn't
Right.
any higher than the average population, but it wasn't lower either.
Right. Well, and also if you find, pornography has been normalized and it got First Amendment rights in the 70s. So it's protected speech. Like one of the law center at Nicosia has a number of cases around pornography against Twitter, against X Video, against Pornhub, against a platform I can't even say the name in polite company. Like it's just unbelievable. But the pornography has been normalized, and yet absolutely it qualifies as, most pornography qualifies as obscenity. And obscenity does not have protection under the First Amendment. This is not well understood or known, but the other irony is, like, people in CIAS at the Department of Justice's, CIAS is the Child Exploitation and Obscenity section. They're not watching pornography. I don't think they realize the horrific violence, racism, anti-Semitism that's at work in those scenes. Really bad stuff.
Yeah, let's see, what else do we have? Is there any research comparing the Bayer treatment program to the Duluth Model Domestic Violence Intervention Program?
Oh, such a good question. We're coming back with the answers on these things. That's a great question.
Okay.
One piece of data, I went to the research, there's a little research team at Nicosia. I was so shocked by this. I heard it in a respected, from a subject matter expert in a meeting on Capitol Hill, and I was like, is that really true? And they showed me the evidence that it was true. There are numerous studies that show people who consume and trade child sexual abuse material, still in the law, child pornography, but we prefer this term, which really makes it clear every single instance is a criminal. It's a picture of a crime. So child sexual abuse material, those who use it, consume it, trade it, 50 to 70% of them are also hands-on offenders or people who try to be hands-on offenders, because their addiction to that material also drives them, like, again, the way the mind, the brain's built, to actually act it out. So it's one of the reasons why we need to be so severe about child pornography and the way we treat those who are found with it on their, phones and computers.
Perfect. Does anyone have any more questions? We need to take advantage of having Eleanor with us now. She's a real expert. So if you have any questions, now's the time.
Eleanor, would you like me to drop in the chat the guidelines for the equality model or the survivors model legislation?
Yeah, that would be great. Or
Yeah.
we could drop it in, and then we can
Okay.
also follow up.
Yeah.
Because this webinar, this system, like people can't talk, like one more child is on the call. Can one more child say anything? I think that's not the
I
way.
think you can unmute. Let's see.
Can people unmute? I just think it'd be great, like if direct service providers are on the call. I always love to hear what direct service providers are seeing and hearing among their clients.
All right. I will unmute her in 1 second. I did want to mention one thing since you mentioned Pornhub. So here in North Carolina, our legislature did pass age verification for pornography. And um, Pornhub got mad at us about that. And now anybody in North Carolina who tries to go on Pornhub can't access it. And I just wanted to share how heartbroken I was about that.
No, they tried that they've used that strategy across the nation and in most states, but not all. They actually implemented age verification in Louisiana. And I'm not, I mean, I think part of it is because Louisiana has a wallet system and it's really easy to ping people in Louisiana and just find out if they're up or down, over 18 or not over 18. Like there's no exchanges there's no need to share identity documentation. So maybe they thought it was easier there, but they're they're criminals. Pornhub is run and owned by criminals. And there is, no doubt that there is plenty of trafficking material, trafficked women on their platform.
So I have unmuted Parker with one more
Hi.
time.
Hi, Eleanor. Thanks so much. This is like, it just matters so much. My supervisor, Claire Jaggers, is on this call. And I think from a direct service provider person who is working directly with survivors, like having these sorts of conversations is extremely validating. And I think allows me to feel like my clients' voices are being heard. And something that
Say it again. Say more though. Why? Why?
yeah.
What are they saying?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think something that I like said to Claire as we've been like processing some of the things that you're saying is I think there's such an interesting relationship that is very different between a survivor's relationship to buyers and their relationship to their traffickers.
Mhm.
And I mean, we even see anecdotally that a lot of violence and even like deaths and things like that are usually targeted towards buyers and not towards traffickers, which I think is I don't have my like clinical licensure. I'm more on the advocacy side and case
Sure.
management side of things. And so I can't speak, directly towards like trauma bonds and things to that extent. But I think it is something that I think is significant is that
Mhm.
there is you mentioned that so often survivors can't remember or mention what happened because they have to disassociate in order to survive, which I think is extremely significant and validating for many of my clients that cannot remember the atrocities that happened to them, but their bodies remember, right?
Yes.
And a lot of times their bodies can retaliate to buyers because there is less of an emotional connection when their bodies will not necessarily allow them to retaliate against their traffickers because their traffickers are meeting some of their basic needs while buyers are not. So I think that is like a very nuanced part of this conversation
Yeah.
that I have been led to think about as you've been outlining some of these things.
Well, also, how about this shocker? The DOJ has an Office on Violence Against Women. Guess who is not included in the list of women who qualify for attention by the office? Women in prostitution. They're not
Yeah.
on the list. They are like a category of humans that's been reserved for abuse.
Mm,
No, it's unacceptable. And even think of all the time intimate partner violence, like the number of times that the woman's bonded with the man who's the trafficker, but he's also the
yes,
boyfriend, or he's also her husband, or he's also,
exactly.
the boyfriend story. That's that's intimate partner violence. That's
Absolutely.
domestic violence. That is a case under the domestic violence shield. Can we access the dollars under DV? No, because it's a trafficking case. We're really looking into this. I had a meeting at HHS just last week where we started unpacking this. Catherine Chung, some of you know, the director of the OTIP office, the Office of Trafficking in Persons, and a brand new President Trump's appointee, senior human trafficking advisor, Kevin Malone, some might know, used to be, he was the head of the U.S. Institute on Human Trafficking. He knows this issue well. He cares about demand and thinks that's the way to shrink the markets. And he's just trying to figure out how to get it in here. But I think this idea of categorizing trafficking more often as domestic violence or interfamilial violence brings us access to more public money that's available, but we aren't qualifying for.
So we've had another question, Eleanor. Is there any information on female buyers?
Nah, there's not. There really isn't. It's just so small. It really is tiny. And Stephanie Powell said, she was the head of advice unit for 15 years and ran into it twice, two cases of female buyers in 15 years. So, I mean, people study all kinds of things. There's probably some academic somewhere that's trying to study this, but it's not common enough to deserve a study. But, prove me wrong. But people anecdotally, Mike would have a better answer for this than I, but
But it would be
anecdotally.
more common. We do know that females are traffickers.
Oh, of
Uh,
course, females are definitely traffickers.
yeah.
Absolutely. I think that the percentage is a lot higher than we credit. Yeah,
Yeah. I
absolutely.
think from what I've seen here, just in cases, primarily cases that have hit the news, or as I've talked with colleagues, in the massage industry, the illicit massage businesses, it's
Mm.
almost always a woman that, well, at least at the local level, is in charge. Now, probably moving up the the ladder, probably not as much,
Oh,
but
there's absolutely no doubt. Women are traffickers for sure in a major way, especially in the illicit massage business.
yeah.
That is undoubted. But are they sex buyers? It's I've never seen any evidence that it's a significant percentage.
All right, so my colleague Nikki has a good one for you.
Nikki from Shield.
Have you had success in explaining demand reduction to political leaders in a way they can get behind? If so, what is a successful approach?
Oh my gosh, it's so good. Yeah, I think we have like the whole story of Texas is fascinating. Come on, if you were going to guess which state would be the first state in our union to make sex buying a felony, would you pick Texas? I wouldn't. It was the product of some 6 or 7 years worth of work. There are a lot of NGOs in Texas dedicated to this subject, and I also think, there are a lot of faith-based NGOs in Texas, and it touches your heart if you read the Bible. You're moved by the stories of slavery and of, Jesus ministering to people in prostitution. So it's natural that people of faith would also have a heart for this topic. But in Texas, it was the mobilization of NGOs. One of the leaders was Jamie Carruthers, who was at Street Grace he's a lawyer, and he was at Street Grace doing policy. Now he's doing homeless issues in Texas. But what they documented, they took state data, and they showed that women in prostitution were being arrested at 12 or 15 times the number of times men buying sex were being arrested. And they just went door to door. They went to the police, the state police, all the sheriffs. They went to everyone with this data. And they said, the only way we're gonna get law enforcement incentivized to pay attention to the buyers driving this market is by making it a felony. Now, really fascinating, people in Oklahoma, law enforcement in Oklahoma started seeing a spillover effect. They said, we have more people buying sex in Oklahoma because of Texas's law. That's one of the reasons Oklahoma was like state number 2, or I think Montana was state number 2 and Oklahoma was state number 3. But this kind of social scientists call it what, dispersal effect or something. It's like where the policy in one state kind of causes it to move elsewhere. And so it moved to Oklahoma, and they try to close that door. That's why we're going to South Carolina and trying to see if South Carolina will adopt the North Carolina model, saying, you know, you don't want these buyers here causing trouble and causing harm. So where it's worked, I think is where, you know, very often data is very important to have, and showing that the ruinous impact on the lives of people in prostitution who are so often vulnerable to homelessness, addiction, DV, you know, you name it. But it's a lot of shoe leather. Like the Texas people told us that for years, they were meeting with law enforcement entities for several years in order to get this far.
I think the stars aligned for us
It
because we did not have to go through all that. It was amazing.
was also, the bill was called like education bill or something, right? It wasn't, it
Yeah,
didn't proclaim what it
that's
did.
that's right. Yep, I have mentioned that to other people that that the South Carolina group, in fact, let them know that they might want to bury it in a larger bill. Another question we have, we are trying to generate parental involvement in countering the sexual exploitation of minors on the internet. What
Mm.
are your thoughts on increasing parent involvement?
Oh my gosh. I was today with talking about this subject with both moms across America and Moms for Liberty and Moms for America. It turns out those are 3 different organizations.
Wow.
One is Moms Across America is sort of aligned with the MAHA movement and the idea that a lot of things are unhealthy, and the Robert Kennedy's Secretary of Health and Human Services, um, the idea that screen time and the vulnerability, like so many of these channels, including like Discord or Roblox, where whistleblowers on Capitol Hill just a couple months ago reported that 100% of the time when kids are using the Oculus glasses for virtual reality, they will be sexually harassed, or comments in their direction, or worse. And the Oculus researchers, were the whistleblowers, also said that there is a much higher percentage of under 13s in the virtual reality space than the companies will admit. So I think, like, of course, educating parents is crucial, because parents seem to have no idea that there's a predator in your pocket. If you've got a smartphone, there's a predator in your pocket, because too many of these digital platforms and channels allow predators to approach kids. I don't know if we can, you know, I'm a public policy person, but can we legislate our way out of this? I mean, even today at Heritage, we were talking about, why aren't we running some public education campaigns, just like give a hoot, don't pollute, like some of the basics. People need to know screen addiction is real and can lead to profound harm, lack of focus, depression, suicide ideation. This is serious stuff. It's like the analogy really should be tobacco, and that big tobacco concealed the harms that they knew existed for a long time. And big tech is concealing the harms they know exist, especially to our youth. And until they're compelled, which might mean repealing Communications Decency Act Section 230, you know, this sort of unintended consequence of a bill passed in 1996. Get this, the bill was passed to prevent kids from seeing pornography online. And the Supreme Court ruled almost the entire bill unconstitutional because of pornography being protected speech. And all that stood, like the little framework that was still up, was this piece that gave immunity, which the courts have interpreted as giving immunity to big tech, making them totally unaccountable and irresponsible. And their legal offices say, don't look for child pornography, because if you don't look for it, you're not compelled to report it to NCMEC. You're not compelled to delete it. So there's some super big problems with our federal law around big tech getting away with murder. Now, how do we convey that to parents? This is an important question. And uh, I think we really need a public education, the PSA, the public service announcement campaign in a big way. But so far, big tech has remained protected by their money and their influence, certainly in Congress. And at the state level too. The bills that we've worked on, age verification bills, we've worked on an App Store Accountability Act, which says, since when can kids sign contracts with big companies? Every time you download an app, the terms of service is a contract. So since it's illegal for kids to sign contracts with companies, so stop allowing them to download any old app. And the other thing is they're rated 4+ or rated for 12+. The developers themselves are rating those apps, and all they want to do is sell more product. So you can't trust the ratings. And too many parents definitely think that those app stores have some kind of guardrails, and they really don't. So Utah, Louisiana, and Texas, once again, Texas in the forefront, passed this App Store Accountability bill, which said parents have to give consent to kids under 18, might be under 17 in one of the states, but minors need parental consent in order to download those apps. And they also need parental consent for spending any money on those apps. But so these age verification efforts continue to be grabbed by state legislatures that really want some solution. The problem with the bill, like the Pornhub didn't comply with an age verification. We supported it, but we weren't like prioritizing it, because to rely on the pornography platforms for age verification, it's like relying on criminals to not commit a crime. Like, we just know too much about these pornography platforms to expect them to do the right thing. They'll find some workaround and they'll collect data on the kids while they're online. Instead, anyway, the point being, age verification is being grabbed on as a solution very quickly, but it's partial. And we need it's like car safety. We need seatbelts and airbags and speed limits and driver's education, right? We need a lot of different ways to protect kids and youth and vulnerable adults online. And so that includes like the Kids Online Safety Act in Congress, or introduced this week, Senators Hawley and Blumenthal. AI chatbots should not be available or targeting kids. They shouldn't be available to minors. These kids are dying by suicide as a result of chatbots, a machine convincing them to take the ultimate gesture of nihilism. I mean, it's shocking. And unfortunately, you're going to hear there are a whole flurry of cases that are about to be introduced, lawsuits being introduced over the next week of November 10th. The Social Media Victims Law Center is introducing a variety of lawsuits for families where severe harm and death was a result of chatbot interaction. So keep your kids away from chatbots and everybody you've ever met.
Eleanor, I am just so grateful that you were willing to come with us tonight and spend this time with us and answer questions from the audience. We are sending out an email to anyone who registered. And so what we'll do is those links that Sarah dropped in the chat for us, we will put those in the email so that people who are here tonight, as well as the people who couldn't be here, because we did encourage people to register if they were interested, even if they couldn't come, because we'll send the recording out. I do see that someone asked about a certificate. If there are people who specifically need one, if you will shoot us an email, we will make that happen. I do want to tell you about the next webinar. So I'm going to share my screen. It doesn't look right. Let's try again. I appreciate y'all's patience with me as I'm trying to get this shared for you. There we go. So next week, we're going to be excuse me, talking about culture. and how and why beliefs shape behavior. And if you all are not familiar with the organization A Call to Men, I strongly encourage you, number one, to look it up, but number two, to definitely register for next week. Ricky Houston is a very engaging speaker, and he's going to talk about just the very idea of how in normal society, we have so normalized how we objectify people, especially women, definitely children, just in our normal everyday lives, in little comments that we make without even thinking about it. Um, and of course, how it's being marketed to us through all kinds of media, including advertising and movies and that kind of stuff. So you can grab the QR code here if you would like. And then the following week, you will not want to miss because we are going to have a survivor leader speaking from her lived experience about her feelings on demand and just how demand impacts victims of trafficking. And she's going to share with us her perspective on survivor-informed approaches to prevention. So I always tell people when I'm doing a training, and the person introduces me and they'll list all the different training that I've received. But the training you get from survivors is the most important training you can get. And then our final one is going to be your role in the ripple effect, joining the demand reduction effort. And we are going to have two different organizations that are going to be with us, Truckers Against Trafficking, which they just do amazing work all across the country. And then the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which pretty much put labor trafficking on the map in the U.S. So hope you will come to that. And the focus on that last session is going to be, what can you do? How can you help the demand reduction effort movement in North Carolina? So we are grateful for you. Even as I already mentioned, if you can't attend one of these, but it sounds interesting to you, go ahead and register for it, and then we can send you the recording afterwards. We are grateful that you were here, and I'm going to close us out.
Thank you, Pam. See you soon.
Thank you, Eleanor. And thank you, Sarah.